Along the misty Massachusetts coast, where the Atlantic winds carry whispers of forgotten sins, there is a decaying stone that few dare approach. Passing fishermen hastily cross themselves, and the most intrepid historians shy away from mentioning it publicly. The stone bears only a year, 1687, and two names that strike fear into the hearts of every devout believer: Ezekiel and Judith Harrington. Over nearly 2 decades, the brothers built an empire of blood and accusation, amassing fortunes on the cries of the innocent and the stolen lands. Yet, when their unholy union produced twins so deformed that even the most hardened physicians fled in terror, people whispered that God's justice had finally arrived. But what really happened in that isolated cabin, where 8-year-olds with twisted bodies and brilliant minds plotted against their own parents? That secret has been buried for centuries under layers of fear and superstition until now. Before we dive into the story of the Harringtons and their terrible legacy, I want to invite you to pause for a moment. If you love dark stories that people would rather forget, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. And let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from? A small town, a big city, or a remote coastal location? For these shadows are all over America. The truth about the Harrington fortune and its cursed heirs reveals a level of calculated cruelty that makes even the most hardened of souls shudder and wonder how far can people go when greed overrides conscience. In the 1660s, the Massachusetts Bay Colony lived in a state of religious fervor, mixed with subsistence hardship. Tiny coastal communities like Wickham's Harbor, a mere 300 souls squeezed between pine forests and sea cliffs, survived by fishing, farming, and an uneasy relationship with the supernatural beliefs that governed every aspect of life. Puritan teachings demanded constant vigilance against Satan's temptations, and in such isolated communities, suspicion could spread faster than fire. Ezekiel Harrington, at 28, had a stern face and piercing grey eyes that would later become a symbol of condemnation and judgment. His sister Judith, 25, was beautiful but austere, with the same angular features and icy coldness. But while Ezekiel commanded attention with his charisma, Judith wielded her influence through whispers and the art of sowing doubt. Both had an unusual education for their class. Their father, a failed merchant in Boston, forced them to learn to read and write, and most importantly, to understand inheritance and land ownership. When their parents died of a fever epidemic in 1663, leaving the sisters with only a modest log house and mounting debts, they faced an uncertain future, like many other young men. But unlike their neighbors who threw themselves into honest labor, the Harringtons saw opportunity in the growing hysteria surrounding the witchcraft obsession. Across New England, people began hiring witch hunters, men who claimed to be experts in identifying Satanists. They charged high fees and, even more lucratively, often received a share of the property seized from those convicted. Ezekiel and Judith's first client was the village of Milford, 2 days' journey away, where crop failures and stillborn cattle had created a gloomy atmosphere that could easily be attributed to demonic forces. Ezekiel claimed to be a learned man, studying the science of black magic. Judith acted as his assistant, skilled at detecting hidden signs on the bodies of suspects. Their method was as simple as it was brutal. Go to a community in crisis, study the wealth balance, and then take turns accusing those who owned the most valuable land or property. The first victim was the widow Constance Fletcher. Her husband had left her a valuable mill, a property coveted by many men in the area. Under the careful planning of the Harringtons, Constance was quickly made the subject of terrifying accusations that she had caused the crops to wither through her association with the devil. The evidence they presented was almost undeniable. Strange marks on Constance's body, actually inflicted by Ezekiel and Judith during a forced search. False testimony from neighbors carefully suggested by Judith that they had seen her mumbling incomprehensible words. And finally, the fact that her mill had continued to operate efficiently while the others had stopped working. Unbeknownst to them, this was only due to her skillful care maintenance and convenient location. On November 15, 1664, Constance Fletcher was hanged. Her mill was divided in two. One part went to the village, the other to Ezekiel and Judith as reward for their work in purging the evil. But this was only the beginning. With Constance's death, a death machine was set in motion. Over the next 15 years, 8 different communities were involved and 57 innocent lives were taken by their calculating hands. Ezekiel and Judith's decision to marry was not motivated by love. Under colonial law, marriages between siblings, when justified, were not out of the question. But here it was cold and calculated. By 1675, the brothers had accumulated assets worth more than $15,000, a huge fortune by the standards of the time. They owned land in 9 communities, held mortgages on dozens of farms and stores, and had a detailed criminal record that had accumulated over a decade. But as they grew, they faced a growing concern inheritance. If either of them married outside the family, the assets would inevitably fall into the hands of the other spouse. Worse, the bloody secrets behind their wealth could be exposed. Conversely, if both died without direct heirs, the fortune could be dispersed to distant relatives or seized by the colonial government. And so, they came up with a solution that reflected their cold-blooded natures: marry each other. Ezekiel, as the older brother, married Judith in secret on December 21st, 1675, the night of the winter solstice, a date chosen not for its spiritual beliefs, but as a symbol of power and new beginnings. A corrupt minister they had bribed during a witch trial in Salem testified along with 2 servants who had been threatened into silence. The ritual conducted in the dark basement of Harrington Manor was nothing short of a mockery of God no love, no spirituality, just a legal ruse to protect wealth and secrecy. And then, in early 1676, Judith became pregnant. Fate seemed to approve their dark plan. For the first several months, the pregnancy progressed normally, without complications or signs of abnormality. The brothers hired a skilled midwife from Boston, paying her a handsome fee to move into the manor. They ordered special foods, rare medicines, and even had 2 cradles made of precious mahogany, lined with soft silk, as if preparing to welcome the children who would inherit a fortune. But as the pregnancy progressed into its final months, strange signs began to appear. So small, fleeting, but enough to sow in the observer's heart a silent fear that something terrible is approaching. The first signs of trouble came in the 7th month of Judith's pregnancy. What should have been the gentle rhythms of new life turned into something far more unsettling. The midwife Sarah Whittam, a woman with decades of experience and over 300 births to her name, paused during an examination with unease written across her face. These were not the kicks and turns of ordinary twins. The movements, she confided in a whisper to her young assistant, Emma Prescott, felt deliberate, forceful. even hostile. "It's as if they're fighting one another," Sarah murmured. "I've delivered twins before many times, but never have I felt such a violent motion. It feels as though they are trying to harm each other." Ezekiel scoffed when told of her fears, brushing them aside as the superstitions of an aging woman. Yet when the night grew still even, he could not dismiss the dread. Too much had been invested in this pregnancy. The siblings had built their empire of accusation and blood on the promise of continuity, and failure could not be tolerated. Ezekiel buried himself in study purchasing every medical text the colonies had to offer, writing to physicians in London and Edinburgh, and questioning midwives from distant towns. What he uncovered was both soothing and deeply alarming. It was true, many sources agreed, that twin pregnancies often involved violent movements born from the struggle for space and survival. But those same texts warned of darker possibilities. When the parents were bound by too close a kinship, the risks multiplied: stillbirth, grotesque malformation, even children born with minds twisted or broken. The birth came on March 15, 1677, and it was a horror Sarah Whittam would never forget. For nearly 2 days, Judith labored. The screams echoed through the manor halls, but what emerged silenced even the most hardened attendants. The twins' bore bodies the human eye was never meant to see, limbs branching at unnatural angles, skulls marked with sharp bony ridges, torsos bound together by strange bridges of living tissue, their organs perhaps entwined within. Yet, against every expectation, these children lived. And more than lived, they observed. From the moment of their arrival, they displayed a terrifying awareness. They reached for objects' clasped fingers and turned their malformed heads toward one another as if speaking in a secret tongue. Sounds and gestures passed between them. Not cries of newborns, but patterns, purposeful, deliberate. Ezekiel and Judith named them Gabriel and Raphael, draping them in the protection of holy names, hoping to shield the boys from the whispers of neighbors or the judgment of the church. But names could not conceal what they were. Against all odds, the children thrived. By their first year, it was clear their minds were racing far ahead of their broken bodies. At 4, they had taught themselves to read laboriously, turning pages with twisted fingers. At 5, they worked through sums and calculations with eerie ease. By 7, they spoke of philosophy of the nature of God, of man's place in creation with words and ideas that would have unsettled university scholars. By the time they reached their 8th birthday in March of 1685, Gabriel and Raphael had become something the colony had never known before. 2 boys whose crippled flesh bound them, but whose intellect blazed with unnatural brilliance. And with that brilliance came a chilling awareness. They began to see their parents clearly. They began to understand. What kind of thoughts do you imagine stirred in those young minds? Minds sharper than blades trapped within frail and twisted bodies as they pieced together the sins and cruelties of Ezekiel and Judith. The twins had lived their entire lives sealed within the dark corridors of the Harrington Manor. To the outside world, their isolation was explained as protection. Protection from cruel stares, from whispered fears of witchcraft, from the prying eyes of a community, quick to call anything unusual the work of the devil. But the truth was far more calculating. Ezekiel and Judith could not risk anyone glimpsing their children's condition, nor the damning reminder those twisted forms offered of what divine judgment might truly mean. Yet, In the silence of their confinement, Gabriel and Raphael were not idle. They watched, they listened. The children learned to still their bodies, to quiet their breath, until their parents forgot they were even in the room. Believing their sons incapable of comprehension, Ezekiel and Judith spoke freely, discussing accusations to be made, evidence to be manufactured, fortunes to be stolen. They left records and letters scattered across tables, never imagining that the malformed hands of their children could piece together such secrets. It was a fatal mistake. By 1685, the twins had gathered a knowledge more dangerous than any weapon, the inner workings of their parents' empire of blood. They knew which witnesses had been bribed, which neighbors had been destroyed for profit, how each innocent life had been snuffed out in the name of wealth. And perhaps most haunting of all, they came to understand that they themselves were the price of this empire, born broken, not by God's wrath or fate's cruelty, but by the cold, selfish union of their parents who had chosen bloodline over morality. The revelation filled the boys with a grief too vast for childhood, and with a fury sharpened by intellect far beyond their years. Though their bodies were frail, their wills grew iron strong. They began to plan, to calculate, to seek justice in whatever form they could manage. Their first chance came in the summer of 1685, when a young woman named Margaret Caldwell came to the manor answering a request for service. She was the daughter of Thomas Caldwell, a blacksmith executed for witchcraft in 1679. After, the Harringtons orchestrated his downfall to seize his forge and land. Margaret did not know the truth. To her, the Harringtons were simply wealthy, respected, perhaps even charitable. She hoped only for work to survive the ruin left by her father's death. What she found, however, was something she could never have imagined: evidence that would one day ignite the greatest scandal of witch trials in colonial America. The twins, desperate and determined, saw in Margaret their chance. They began to reach out in secret. With their warped hands, they scratched messages, leaving them in places Margaret would stumble upon while cleaning. At first, the notes were simple, vague hints about suspicious ledgers, whispers of hidden documents. But as her trust grew, so too did their courage. Soon Gabriel and Raphael were guiding her directly to evidence describing where incriminating letters were hidden, which accounts concealed stolen fortunes, and whose deaths had been engineered with chilling precision. They even learned to shield her. The boys had memorized the rhythms of the manor, knew which visitors came to strike bargains in shadows, which men brought danger far greater than Ezekiel or Judith alone. With careful signals, they warned Margaret when such figures were near, helping her avoid encounters that might have cost her life. And then, in September of 1680, came the moment that changed everything. The twins directed Margaret to Ezekiel's study, to a false wall concealing a secret compartment. Inside lay the ledgers, detailed financial records spanning 15 years, written in Ezekiel's precise damning hand. Accounts of property, seized, of payments to false witnesses, of every life stolen to build the Harrington empire. The children had struck their first true blow, and the walls of the Harrington legacy had begun at last to crack. The ledgers, once opened, revealed more than mere numbers. They told the story of lives measured, purchased, and destroyed. Each entry listed not only the payments received for every witch trial, but also the spoils of those false condemnations. The homes seized, the fields, taken the shops and forges stripped away. There were estimates of value notations of preparation costs, even fees for the witnesses whose words had been bought and shaped. It was not chaos. It was a system perfected over years, where murder masqueraded as justice and profit wore the cloak of divine judgment. When Margaret turned these pages, she felt her hands tremble. What she held was not rumor, not suspicion, but undeniable proof that the Harrington siblings had constructed their wealth upon a mountain of stolen lives. Yet, with each discovery came a realization: if Ezekiel and Judith suspected her knowledge, her fate would be no different from the others. Their methods left no survivors. Her only chance of survival and of protecting the fragile twins who had entrusted her with their secrets lay in exposing the truth with cunning equal to theirs. Rather than fleeing with the evidence or confronting her employers, Margaret chose a path more subtle and dangerous. She began copying the most damning documents in secret, hiding them among her few possessions. And at the same time, she reached out to a man who might understand the layers of both crime and corruption that these records represented. His name was Father Benedict Thorne, a Jesuit newly arrived from France, trained in theology, but also in the shadows where faith, reason, and deception meet. At first, Father Thorne listened with polite skepticism. Accusations against the Harringtons were perilous, for their respectability was a fortress built over decades. But as Margaret shared her fragments, financial ledgers with neat columns of bloodless arithmetic, lists of witnesses annotated with bribes and threats, and maps tracing confiscated lands now resting in the siblings' possession, the priest's disbelief withered into a deep, appalled silence. What Margaret revealed painted not just corruption but a vast machinery of evil, operating unchecked in the heart of the colony. Thorne was no ordinary cleric. His studies in both theology and natural philosophy had sharpened him to recognize deception and to sense the moral weight of unrepented crimes. Unlike officials who might scoff at whispers of the supernatural, or physicians who might see only the twins' twisted bodies, Thorne was willing to confront both the worldly and the spiritual dimensions of the Harrington Empire. And so, in October of 1685, he crossed the threshold of the Harrington Manor under the guise of a simple pastoral call. Ezekiel and Judith, confident in their ability to mold priests and magistrates alike, welcomed him warmly. They imagined they could charm this newcomer as they had charmed so many others. They saw in him an opportunity to polish their reputation, to tighten their grip on the community. What they failed to see was the precision in Thorne's gaze, the way he studied not just their words, but the atmosphere of the house itself. Within moments of entering, the priest sensed something amiss, an almost tangible residue, not of spirits or curses, but of years steeped in deliberate cruelty. The walls seemed to whisper of the deeds they had contained. And when he asked with pastoral gentleness to meet the children, his request was granted without suspicion. The Harringtons had no fear of Gabriel and Raphael being understood. To them, the twins were helpless shadows. But when Thorne stepped into their chambers, he discovered something altogether unexpected. Margaret had told him of their intelligence, their desperate courage, but even her words had not prepared him for the truth. The twins, though twisted by pain and limited in body, greeted him with clear eyes. Their silence was not emptiness, but patience. Their stillness, not confusion but endurance. They showed no fear of the priest. Instead, their faces carried something that had long been absent from that house relief, and the fragile glimmer of hope. It was clear to Father Thorn that the twins had been waiting, perhaps for years, for someone with the authority, the courage, and the faith to confront their parents. The moment he entered their chamber, they tried to communicate what they had seen. The whispers of crimes, the hidden caches of evidence, the shadows of lives extinguished. Their gestures, their attempts at writing their eyes, everything carried a desperate urgency. Thorn's training in theology had prepared him for many things, but most of all, it had taught him to minister to souls who had endured unspeakable cruelty. In these children, he recognized the same mixture of awareness, anguish, and fragile hope that he had seen in survivors of torture. Yet, unlike the martyrs and prisoners he had once consoled, Gabriel and Raphael were trapped. Their bodies betrayed them, their dependence bound them, and the very people who clothed and fed them were the ones who had caused their suffering. His departure from the manor was cordial on the surface, but both sides understood something had shifted. Thorn had seen too much asked too precisely, and Ezekiel and Judith had recognized in him a dangerous clarity. A confrontation had begun, quiet and visible, but inevitable. When Father Thorn returned to Boston, he did not act in haste. His investigation unfolded with the slow, methodical weight of the church itself. Unlike the colony's crude courts, the Jesuit networks stretched across continents. They knew how to gather testimony, to sift truth from invention, to build cases against those who thought themselves untouchable. Within 3 weeks, Thorn had compiled a damning dossier, financial records discreetly subpoenaed from colonial banks' testimonies, from relatives of victims who still lived in silence, and most devastating of all, the confession of Marcus Fletcher. Fletcher, a former accomplice, broke beneath questioning. He spoke of planting evidence, of coaching witnesses, of weaving lies so tightly that judges and juries could scarcely breathe beneath him. He named names. He described methods, and he revealed the full scope of the Harrington Empire, how victims were chosen, how land was seized, how officials were bribed to turn justice into a weapon. But Fletcher's words carried something even darker. He admitted knowledge of the siblings' incestuous union, their calculated choice to bring children into the world, not out of love, but to safeguard their fortune. Worse still, he spoke of their plans to display Gabriel and Raphael to wealthy patrons, selling the children's suffering as spectacle. This revelation was almost too much to comprehend. It was one thing to destroy strangers for profit. It was another to create life itself for exploitation. Yet the greatest weapon Thorn discovered was not in Fletcher's testimony, nor in the ledgers, nor in the maps of stolen land. It was in the twins themselves. Despite their fragile bodies, Gabriel and Raphael remembered everything. Their recollections of overheard conversations, of bribes arranged, of victims chosen, these details aligned perfectly with the evidence. And beyond the facts, their intelligence and moral clarity made them undeniable witnesses. No one who looked into their eyes could dismiss their words as fantasy. Through Margaret's quiet courage, secret interviews were arranged. By candlelight in whispers, the twins revealed the depths of their torment. They spoke of being used like experiments, prodded and cut. Without anesthetic, their cries ignored. They described being denied food or warmth unless they performed intellectual tasks their parents demanded. They recounted their parents' obsession with documenting every detail of their growth, intending to sell reports to European physicians eager to study the effects of bloodline unions. The picture that emerged was one of horror, refined into science. By the end of 1685, tension hung over Harrington Manor like a storm that refused to break. Thorne's evidence was now irrefutable, yet the danger of exposing the siblings too abruptly was immense. If cornered, Ezekiel and Judith might destroy not only their records, but their children as well. Meanwhile, Gabriel and Raphael grew bolder, scribbling notes, creating hidden caches of observations that Margaret could later retrieve. They recorded conversations, plots, even plans for future acquisitions. But the siblings were not blind. They began to notice small defiance in their children's eyes, the faint signs of independence. And to Ezekiel and Judith, such defiance was not a cause for pride. It was a threat. The question whispered itself in that dark house, unanswered: what would parents such as these do when they realized their children were no longer silent tools, but active conspirators against them? The unraveling of the Harrington Empire began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in early December of 1685. Ezekiel, during one of his habitual inspections of the hidden ledgers in his study, noticed something he had never overlooked before: faint scratches along the false panel hinges that bore the slightest stress marks and dust, disturbed in ways that suggested more than casual handling. Worse still, the most incriminating pages, those that named bribed officials, listed fraudulent property seizures, and noted payments for false testimony, had been marked with nearly invisible dots of graphite. Someone had been studying these records with care. Ezekiel's suspicions fell immediately upon Margaret Caldwell. She had motive, she had opportunity, and she had always seemed too observant for a servant. Together, he and Judith subjected her to the brutal methods they had once perfected upon accused witches' deprivation threats, the calculated cruelty of questions asked in the dead of night. Margaret admitted what she knew, but under even the harshest pressure, her knowledge did not match the precision of the intrusions Ezekiel had discovered. She was guilty of courage, not betrayal. The possibility that their own children had been watching, listening, and recording their own blood. Their supposed dependence never entered the siblings' minds. Their blindness was complete. Gabriel and Raphael, in their eyes, were creatures of pity, not power. That miscalculation born of arrogance would cost them everything. For while Ezekiel and Judith sharpened their suspicions against Margaret and Father Thorne, the twins continued their work with increasing skill. Deprived of normal strength, they had honed the strength of the mind. They used scraps of paper hidden in furniture seams, coded taps against the walls, even the placement of household objects to pass messages between them. Every limitation forced ingenuity. Every silence became a weapon. By mid-December, their archive was astonishing. Not only had they catalogued years of past crimes, but they had also mapped their parents' future ambitions. The twins knew of plans to exploit unrest in the Connecticut River Valley, where fear of raids could be twisted into new witchcraft accusations. More chilling still, they had overheard discussions about themselves, about how accidents could so easily claim the lives of fragile children in a hard winter. Gabriel and Raphael understood with piercing clarity they would not live to see another spring unless they acted first. And so they planned, not with desperation but with strategy. They would not simply escape. They would not merely survive. They would force their parents through carefully orchestrated circumstances to reveal their true nature before witnesses who could not be bought or silenced. It was a plan worthy of the very minds that had shaped them but turned now toward justice rather than corruption. The date was chosen not by chance but by ritual. December 21st, 1680 Eve, the winter solstice and the 10th anniversary of Ezekiel and Judith's secret marriage. Each year, the siblings marked this day with a private celebration, more revealing of their pride and depravity than any public act. That night would be different. That night, the twins would transform their parents' ritual of secrecy into a stage for revelation. And so, as the cold deepened and the shadows of the solstice lengthened across Massachusetts, the final act began to take shape. The plan the twins had conceived demanded perfect timing, unshakable commitment, and a kind of courage rarely found even in grown men and women. Yet these were not adults but children. Children who had never known life beyond the walls of their prison home. And still, Gabriel and Raphael understood something. Their parents had never imagined the piercing clarity that comes from enduring injustice and the intelligence to turn that clarity into action. On the night of December 21st, 1685, their design unfolded with a precision that spoke of months of secret preparation. They were only 8 years old, yet already they thought like investigators hardened by years of study. Their plan rested on a knowledge that only they could possess an intimate familiarity with their parents' habits, their rituals, their methods of cruelty. Ezekiel and Judith had never once suspected that the children they considered weak and voiceless had been listening all along. For every winter's night, the siblings held their anniversary ritual above the children's chambers, a ceremony of wealth of names, read from their victim lists of new crimes plotted under candlelight. For years, Gabriel and Raphael had lain in silence, memorizing every word. And so, it was with deliberate calm that they arranged for Father Thorn to come that very evening, while the celebration was at its height. The atmosphere in the manor was thick that night, heavy with the unseen presence of malice. Ezekiel and Judith were preparing to close one chapter of their lives to leave Massachusetts for Carolina, where suspicion had not yet followed them. Their records were tallied, their property ready to be sold, their identities prepared for rebirth. They believed themselves secure, untouchable. Meanwhile, confined to their chamber, the twins had worked in secret with the methodical patience of conspirators. They had hidden evidence throughout the house maps of stolen lands, copies of incriminating documents, even written testimonies of what they had overheard. And more daring still, they had spent months weakening the manor itself, studying architecture, until they could bend wood and stone to their purpose. It was knowledge no child should have, yet necessity had forged them into something far beyond ordinary children. Father Thorn had not come unprepared. In the weeks before, he had studied the grounds, traced escape routes, and established a secret code of signals with the children through their chamber windows. His years as a chaplain in the wars of Europe had taught him more than scripture. They had taught him strategy. And he knew this would be no ordinary visit. He did not arrive alone. With him came officials armed with warrants, physicians to examine the children, clerks to preserve evidence, and even an engineer prepared for whatever dangers might lie hidden in the Harrington estate. All understood that there would be no second chance. Either the truth would be revealed tonight, or it would vanish forever. At precisely 7 o'clock, Father Thorn knocked upon the great door. Inside, Ezekiel and Judith were deep in their ritual, surrounded by ledgers, letters, and lists that no denial could explain away. At first, their confidence held. They had evaded suspicion for more than 2 decades, and they expected to do so again. But as the priest spoke, something unsettled them. His tone was steady, his questions too precise, his knowledge of their home uncomfortably exact. And then came the request that pierced the illusion entirely. Father Thorn asked to see Gabriel and Raphael to offer prayers for the children's health. The words seemed simple enough, but both parents knew in that instant that something had shifted. At first, Ezekiel and Judith's instinct was to deny Father Thorn's request, as they had done so many times before. They had grown practiced in explaining that the children were too fragile, too easily agitated. But even they understood that refusal offered now might rouse suspicion. The priest's eyes were too knowing, his questions too precise. And so, in a decision that would unravel everything they had built, the siblings allowed him entry to the chamber. The moment the door opened, Father Thorn gave a subtle sign, the signal he and the twins had arranged in secret. What happened next was something their parents had never prepared for. With voices strained by their bodies' limitations, but sharpened by years of memory, Gabriel and Raphael began to speak. They recited crimes with an accuracy that cut through the air like a blade. Names, dates, hidden places. On the night of September 14th, 1679, Gabriel whispered their father and mother had met with Marcus Fletcher in the cellar. They plotted the downfall of Thomas Caldwell, planting false evidence and exchanging silver coins stolen from Rebecca Whitmore's jewelry. Raphael continued seamlessly describing how a puppet stuffed with a child's hair, taken under the guise of a medical inspection, was hidden beneath an anvil, ready to be discovered by witnesses who had been told exactly where to look. Each revelation struck like a hammer blow. For the first time, Ezekiel and Judith were hearing their own secrets spoken aloud, and by the children they had thought powerless. But the twins did not stop. They unveiled caches of stolen property, described networks of bribery, and revealed murders so carefully concealed that no one had ever even suspected them. Beneath the eastern corner of the study, Raphael said, his voice steadier, "Now, there lies a chest. Inside are 37 pieces of jewelry, including the wedding ring of Mary Hutchins." Gabriel took up the account, naming the crime that had secured that ring, how their father poisoned a cow, then claimed the death as proof of witchcraft, sending Mary to the gallows and claiming her land for himself. The children's testimony was devastating. Their words carried the weight of suffering, the precision of witnesses who had listened and remembered. And now, with Father Thorn's clerks recording every syllable, with other officials present to hear their voices, could no longer be silenced. Ezekiel and Judith showed no shame, no fear, not even anger at their children's betrayal. Their thoughts moved only to calculation. How to silence the room, how to escape. At first, they tried to discredit the children, muttering that the twins' minds were clouded by sickness. But Father Thorn was ready. He produced documents corroborating evidence testimonies that matched the twins' words exactly. the lie collapsed. And so, with their empire crumbling around them, Ezekiel and Judith turned to the plan they had always kept in reserve. Weapons hidden in the walls. Routes of escape buried into the very structure of the house. They had prepared for this possibility, but they had never imagined that their own children would be the ones to bring it about. When violence came, it came swiftly and with a brutality that revealed the siblings' true nature. But even this Gabriel and Raphael had foreseen. Even this they had prepared for. The twins had spent long months preparing for this moment, watching, listening, and quietly dismantling their parents' carefully designed escape plans. Every trap Ezekiel and Judith had laid their children had already unraveled. Every weapon hidden in shadowed walls they had already studied and sabotaged. So when Ezekiel drew a pistol from beneath his coat and leveled it at Father Thorn, the weapon betrayed him. Gabriel's patient sabotage, tiny shards of metal placed deep within the barrel, transformed the gun into a curse upon its wielder. It exploded in Ezekiel's hand, shredding flesh and bone, leaving him writhing, unable to fight. Judith fared no better. With a knife concealed in her sleeve, she lunged toward the officials. But Raphael had prepared for her desperation. The loosened floorboards beneath her feet gave way, sending her crashing into a pit of splintered wood. As she fell, hidden mechanisms triggered, doors slammed shut. Iron latches dropped and windows sealed. The house itself seemed to betray its masters, locking them in. The final act played out in the manor's great hall. For months, Gabriel and Raphael had studied the house's bones, weakening beams with careful precision, carving the skeleton of collapse into its very frame. Now their calculations came alive. As Ezekiel and Judith tried one last time to silence their children, the floor groaned, the walls shuddered, and the house folded in upon itself. The collapse was no accident. It was an execution. Heavy timbers pinned Ezekiel and Judith beneath the wreckage, while a pocket of safety, a small alcove the twins had engineered, sheltered Gabriel, Raphael, Father Thorn, and the rescuers. The siblings' prison had become their parents' tomb, and with the ruin came revelation. The broken walls exposed hidden chambers, caches of jewels ledgers inked with bribery and blood, and bones of the forgotten dead. Every secret the Harringtons had buried now lay naked before the world. When the dust finally settled, the scene was one of eerie symmetry. Ezekiel and Judith lifeless beneath the beams, their faces frozen in disbelief. And the twins frail, battered but alive. Their eyes burned not with fear but with clarity. They had endured and they would speak. Their testimony, combined with the physical evidence unearthed from the wreckage, was a blade sharper than any their parents had ever wielded. The courts wasted no time. Within days, colonial authorities delivered posthumous convictions on 57 counts of murder alongside charges of fraud, conspiracy, and judicial corruption. The scale of the crimes, the depth of deceit shook the very foundations of Massachusetts law. Historians would later call it the most sweeping criminal prosecution in all of colonial America. But for those who stood among the ruins, it was more than law, more than punishment. It was the chilling realization that the witch trials themselves, the sacred machinery of justice, had been bent and broken by greed. And in that moment, a single haunting question hung heavy in the winter air: if this could happen here, How many other trials, how many other deaths had been nothing more than murder, disguised as righteousness. The collapse of Harrington Manor did more than bury two criminals beneath its ruins. It unearthed a truth so systematic, so chilling, that the colonies could no longer look away. The meticulous records, the hidden ledgers, the bones of the forgotten, they all revealed not just the crimes of one family, but the rot of an entire system. Father Benedict Thorne's investigation reached beyond the Harringtons. He traced their ties to corrupt magistrates and pliant officials, men who had turned accusations of witchcraft into currency, exchanging lives for land whispers for wealth. Soon other colonies revealed patterns disturbingly similar. False evidence planted testimonies, coached fortunes built on ashes. Could it be? People began to wonder that the scourge of witchcraft was less about the devil and more about human greed. The answer haunted New England. Trials were reviewed, procedures dismantled, reforms forced upon reluctant courts. One by one, communities faced the bitter realization that justice itself had been twisted into a weapon. It took 3 years to unravel the Harrington fortune. Over $25,000 worth of property, farmland homes, businesses had to be stripped from fraudulent hands and painstakingly restored to the families of the wrongfully executed. Imagine, dear listener, the shock of inheritors receiving deeds to lands they had thought lost forever, coupled with the grief of knowing their loved ones had died, to enrich a brother and sister's empire of blood. But amid this reckoning, something unexpected emerged. Gabriel and Raphael, the very children bred to protect. That empire did not wither in the aftermath. Under the care of Dr. William Harvey, a royal physician summoned from London, they began to heal and even to flourish. Dr. Harvey quickly discovered what their parents had so carefully concealed. Much of their frailty had been manufactured. Years of neglect, calculated starvation, and forced dependence had been designed to keep them weak. With food medicine and gentle exercise, their bodies strengthened. With patience, their minds bloomed. The twins absorbed knowledge with a hunger that startled even the most learned scholars. Within months, they were reading, beyond the grasp of most adults, solving mathematical puzzles that confounded visiting academics and sketching works of art with uncanny precision. They were no longer curiosities hidden in the shadows of Harrington Manor. They had become living proof that intelligence and dignity could not be crushed by cruelty. Dr. Harvey's journals on their progress would later become cornerstones of an emerging science, what he called medical psychology. His writings challenged old beliefs that deformity meant diminished mind, showing instead that nurture, education, and kindness could unlock brilliance even in the most fragile-seeming bodies. And through it all, Gabriel and Raphael remained central to the pursuit of justice. Their testimony, vivid and precise, confirmed every hidden ledger and every whispered confession. They remembered dates, names, even exact phrases their parents had used when plotting deaths. Officials once skeptical were left silent as child voices recited details no imagination could have invented. But perhaps what moved people most was not their intellect, but their composure. Despite years of torment, the twins showed no bitterness, no brokenness of spirit. Physicians expected to find madness, despair, or hatred. Instead, they found clarity, a steadiness of moral purpose that seemed almost otherworldly. And so, though their bodies still mark them as different, their minds and their courage quickly won respect. In time, people no longer whispered of them as medical oddities, but as survivors, symbols of a truth their parents had tried so hard to bury that even in the darkest chambers of human cruelty, resilience and light can endure. The story of Gabriel and Raphael did not end with their rescue. In truth, it had only just begun. What the world witnessed in the years that followed was nothing short of a quiet revolution. One born not of violence or vengeance, but of resilience, learning, and the slow reshaping of how society perceived those who were different. The twins, once hidden away in a house of cruelty, became living proof that human potential could not be measured by the frailty of the body. Their very existence challenged long-held assumptions. For how could anyone now claim that physical difference defined worth when Gabriel and Raphael had shown that intellect and spirit could shine even brighter in the face of hardship? Their lives became an argument that whispered into every courtroom, every schoolroom, every gathering place across the colonies. Gabriel, thoughtful and deliberate, turned toward the law. Despite his physical limitations, he became a scholar whose writings carried unusual weight. His works on evidence witness protection and the corrosive dangers of judicial corruption did not simply sit on library shelves. They reshaped practice. Judges and lawyers sought him out when cases grew tangled or when children were called to testify. From his pen emerged the first formal procedures designed to shield the youngest and most vulnerable witnesses from exploitation. Can you imagine how different justice might have looked had Gabriel not chosen this path? Raphael, by contrast, chose the world of medicine. Where his brother had written laws, Raphael healed wounds, both visible and unseen. His practice broke sharply with the harsh methods of his time. He insisted that a patient was not a collection of symptoms, but a whole human being worthy of dignity and compassion. In his care, children born with physical differences found acceptance instead of shame. Survivors of abuse found kindness instead of dismissal. He went further still, establishing the first school in colonial America dedicated to children with disabilities. There, learning was not a privilege, but a right, and the results startled the skeptics. Children once dismissed as incapable blossomed under his instruction, proving that intellect could flourish if only given the chance. Both brothers, scarred by a past that might have broken others, built futures marked by love. Each married, each raised families of their own. Their children bore no trace of the shadows that had once haunted Harrington bloodlines. The twisted legacy of Ezekiel and Judith ended with them. In its place grew households defined by stability, laughter, and possibility. Could there be a more powerful answer to cruelty than to raise children in kindness? The implications reached far beyond family life. Gabriel and Raphael's recovery and triumph became touchstones in debates about child development trauma and the human capacity for resilience. Their lives were studied, quoted, and used as evidence that no fate was sealed. No child beyond hope if only care and compassion were given. And then, of course, there was Father Benedict Thorne. His work did not fade into obscurity. His methods of gathering evidence, of protecting witnesses, of daring to stand against entrenched corruption, they became models for others who followed. In time, his documentation of the Harrington affair was required reading for legal scholars and religious authorities alike. Through his records, future generations learned how easily evil could take root when institutions remained unchecked, and how necessary vigilance was to prevent the abuse of authority. As for the Harrington Manor itself, its remains were never rebuilt. Instead, colonial leaders declared it a memorial ground. Its ruined walls stood as a stern reminder how quickly justice can be corrupted when superstition rules over reason and when fear overrides courage. Funds from the confiscated Harrington estates supported the site, ensuring that visitors' children, families, scholars might walk among its stones and remember. And perhaps as you picture those ruins half buried in moss and silence, you might ask yourself, do such places hold onto echoes of the lives they once contained? Could the walls, if they had voices, whisper the lessons of Gabriel Raphael and all those who suffered before them? Beneath the overgrown grass, one simple stone still stands. It marks the resting place of Gabriel and Raphael, but also carries an inscription. They themselves composed a message intended not just for their own time, but for all who would come after. Here lies the evidence that evil is not supernatural. It is a human choice made by ordinary people who value comfort over conscience. Let all who pass remember justice depends on the courage of those who refuse silence in the face of wrongdoing. Those words carved in stone echo louder than any sermon. They remind us that the Harrington case was never truly about witches or curses, but about choices that revealed how easily communities can be led astray when fear and superstition are allowed to guide judgment. Perhaps most striking of all, the story showed that children, no matter their condition or social standing, hold within them dignity, agency, and a moral clarity that adults too often overlook. Gabriel and Raphael, though utterly dependent on their parents for survival, still found the strength to speak truth against them. Imagine the courage that must have taken. Their defiance not only unraveled a criminal empire, but reshaped how society thought about childhood disability and responsibility. Their legacy rippled far beyond their lifetime. From their testimony and survival grew arguments for children's rights, for protections against abuse, for recognition of human dignity, even in those deemed weakest. The brothers' lives challenged centuries of prejudice, proving that intellect and conscience could not be measured by physical form. Their story became a lantern in the dark, casting light into corners where cruelty had once thrived unseen. Even now, centuries later, their tale still resonates. When we discuss child protection, disability rights, or the prevention of institutional abuse, we are, whether knowingly or not, walking in the shadow of Gabriel and Raphael. Their survival shows us that abuse cannot extinguish dignity, that neglect cannot erase resilience, and that with compassion, even the most wounded lives can flower into something extraordinary. But it also warns us. For nearly 2 decades, the Harrington family thrived in darkness, not because of supernatural power, but because they understood how to manipulate fear, how to turn suspicion into profit, how to make neighbors betray one another. Their defeat came not through divine punishment, but through the bravery of a few who refused to look away. And so, I leave you with a question. Do you think the Harringtons were unique? Or were there others scattered through colonial America who cloaked their crimes in the language of witchcraft and judgment, building their fortunes on terror and silence? How many so-called divine punishments might in truth have been carefully orchestrated murders? If you have thoughts, share them in the comments I'd love to hear your theories. And if you've enjoyed unraveling this mystery with me tonight, remember to subscribe, tap the bell, and share this story with someone who loves exploring the darker hidden chapters of America's past. Rest well and join me next time when we open another door into the forgotten shadows of history.